This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. This week, 3 interviews from the recent Toronto Comicon. Koom was there and talked with Dave Dorman, best known for his work on Star Wars comics, Howard Mackie, a former Marvel editor and writer of Ghost Rider, Spider-Man, and the X-Men, and John McCrea, best known as a collaborator with Garth Ennis, including on DC's Hitman series. Dave Dorman in a moment. First, don't forget that your pledge via Patreon helps keep the show going. Check out our goals and rewards and make your pledge at patreon.com/deconcomics, or send a one-time donation of any amount via PayPal at donate@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
This is Koom for Deconstructing Comics at the Toronto Comicon, and I'm here with
Dave Dorman.
Dave, where do you hail from?
I live in Chicago, and I moved around a lot when I was a kid, so I can't really say I hail from anywhere in particular, but I've been in Chicago for 10 years, so that's close enough.
And you're probably from the South.
Right. I've lived in the South most of my life in Florida, which, you know, not the terrible winter weather that Chicago has, but Toronto, but you take the good with the bad.
Now, you were saying at the panel that you're mostly self-taught.
Correct, mostly self-taught. I took 1 year of college with a liberal arts major. They were teaching sort of gallery painting and modern art, which I didn't want to do. I knew that I wanted to learn illustration. So my interest in comics sort of pushed me into looking into the Kubert School. And at that time, it was just a 2-year school. It was the second year of the school being open. And all they were teaching at that time was a drawing, a black and white, inked, pencil ink style drawing, which is what comics is drawn in, black and white pen and ink. They didn't have any color curriculum at that time. They had no painting curriculum. But I thought that, I'd like to give that a shot. And it was really there that I found that I was happier doing single illustration to tell a story. And I was working on my painting at the same time that I was at the school. And Joe Kubert knew that. He was still the head of the school at that time, and still working actually in the school. He had a studio in the school. And at the end of my first year, Joe brought me into his office and said, basically, he said, the school can't teach me anything more because the direction that I want to go, it just really isn't in pen and ink comics. It's in color, it's in painting. And so he really was very aware of what I wanted to do in the future, direction that I wanted to go in. He was that with all the students. He was very, very astute in keeping an eye on the students, and so for me that was it. I just dropped out of school altogether. Well, I finished that 1 year, but that was the last of my education. I just started teaching myself more how to paint and how to draw. Just spent time working at both of those mediums, and eventually it paid off.
So if you were there at the second year, you must have known like Bissett and Veitch and those guys.
Right, yeah. The first year was Steve Bissett and Rick Veitch and Tom Yates and a whole bunch of other artists that are still in the field. The second year, my year, was Tom Mandrake and Jan Duursema, Craig Boldman, who went into humor illustration. I'm sure there's a few. John Tolliban was in my class. A couple other folks that went on into illustration. and it was a great year. It was, each class was very small, and everybody knew each other, and we all helped each other, with doing work or understanding, what teachers were trying to expect from us, and some of the guys in ahead of my class, Steve Bissett and Rick Veach and those guys, some of them were getting professional work already, so they'd ask us to give them a hand in doing backgrounds or something like that, and it was good. It was a really good time for me because I made a lot of friends for a lifetime at that school.
Right. So you knew very early on that you wanted to do painted work, and did you have a very strong sense of style from the get-go, or how did that start?
No, I didn't have a real set style. My influences when I started to paint were Boris, Frazetta, Michael Whalen, Don Mates, a lot of guys who were pretty famous in doing science fiction and fantasy illustration at that time period during the mid to late 70s and early into the 80s. After I started to learn more about art, the year that I spent in liberal arts college, I started looking at other eras of artwork, specifically the turn of the 20th century, learning about N.C. Wyeth and the classic illustrators, J.C. Leyendecker, Frank Schoonover, these guys who were just giants in the industry, moving into Dean Cornwell and Norman Rockwell a little bit later in the century.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, those were all influences on me. So as I was teaching myself how to paint, I would just not try to swipe their style, but figure out how they laid the paint onto the canvas, onto the board, and figure out what they were doing with their textures and how they got to a certain look. And then my drawing is really what drove my style, because for me a good painting has to have a good drawing underneath, which most illustrators will tell you that.
Right. Are you at all influenced by Drew Struzman or some of those? Because your work reminds me of a certain era of movie posters.
Oh, certainly. I've always been a movie fan since I was a kid, and I love to look at the movie posters back in the 60s and 70s when they were illustrations.
Yes.
And so that certainly influenced a lot of my interest in art as well, because then basically a movie poster was telling a story in a single image, just like I wanted to do.
Right.
So certainly that was an influence as well. And then when I got into the mid 80s, late 80s, it was still an influence. However, I had developed my own style. I was getting work doing covers for various comics and other publications, doing some toy designs and things like that. And Drew Struzan was one of the major poster illustrators, and ended up to be one of the last poster illustrators in the business, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But he had a real sort of graphic-y, dynamic style that I really liked, but it wasn't. It was a little bit too graphic-y for me. I was painting a little bit more realistically with sort of an illustration flair.
Right.
But when I got into doing Indiana Jones and then Star Wars for Dark Horse Comics, I sort of adapted a little bit more of his style, because I felt that style was very appropriate for what the fans wanted to see.
Right.
And so I adapted a few of the techniques that he uses, combined with my techniques, to give the artwork that I liked, and I thought that the fans would like as well, and would identify immediately with Indiana Jones and Star Wars.
Okay. I have a bunch of questions for you about the drawing and the painting. So you mentioned one of the things you do to set up your paintings is a very meticulous attention to drawing.
Right.
So how do you get the compositions that you do, and also how do you get the likenesses that you do?
The easy question is the likenesses. I always use photo reference when I'm doing licensed characters, actor-based characters.
Do you always have a knack for it, or do you have any tricks?
You know, it goes back to a good drawing. You know, if the drawing looks like the character, the painting will look like the character.
Right.
So, you know, there's no trick other than not having to rely on my memory for what somebody looks like or what an actor looks like. I rely on that photo reference that I can get to constantly be refreshing my memory about certain, how the shape of the eye is, how the shape of the nose is, the mouth, the jaw.
You don't have any
hairline.
particular tricks where you start with something first, that you focus on something?
Not really. Usually it's the eyes because it's in the middle of the head.
Right.
But it's just form. You draw the circle for the head, and then you block it off, and you do the cross sections for the eye, and then the nose where the mouth is, and then you start building it from there. How heavy the brow is, if there's shadow under the eye, under the nose, how gaunt the cheeks are. You're not having to rely on your memory to say, do Marlon Brando. I couldn't draw Marlon Brando here to save my life, but if I got some reference together,
right.
I had that to refresh my memory for all the fine details that make that drawing look like Marlon Brando, then it will look like Marlon.
But you always had the ability to look at a photo of Marlon Brando and then capture that, as opposed to developing like a technique.
I haven't developed any specific techniques. It's just learning how to draw, basically. It just sort of happened. I mean, you could say, maybe it was a natural, ability to be able to capture that likeness.
Right.
But still, I felt like I've worked very, very hard to get where I've gotten, and I know that I certainly worked very hard to make sure that I got the likenesses right, because that's part of what I enjoyed, specifically with movie posters. And just being a film fan in general. And
much of that was self-taught.
Yes.
That's impressive.
Yeah, I mean, you look at things, you read books, you ask, other artists, how they do it. The one year at the Kubert School, they were very concentrated on structure, anatomy, things like that. So you just pick up a lot of things over time, and you incorporate that into your work. You figure out. You show your work to other people. They give you some critique. You take that critique back to the studio. You adjust what you're doing to make it a little bit more like you want it to be, and then you show it again. And it's just back and forth until you get satisfied with what you're doing, and then hopefully the client that you're trying to get work from is satisfied as well.
Great. Let's talk about the painting. So I'd love to ask both about the layers and the kind of the glowing tones or tinctures that you get. How do you work towards those things?
Well, I think one of the main things about my particular style is that I taught myself how to paint. So I didn't have a teacher or a mentor or someone looking over my shoulder and saying, you can't do that. I just basically got the paints out, I spread them on my board and just moved them around until I figured out what I was doing. And for me, learning how to paint was basically copying somebody else's artwork. I copied Frazetta, I copied Boris, I copied Michael Whalen, I copied the artists that I liked and looked at their artwork and looked very close at their artwork. And if I could see the originals, then that was very helpful as well. I was very fortunate early in my career that Frazetta's wife was taking his paintings around to some conventions, and I was able to look at those very close up. Jim Steranko was bringing those shadow paintings around to shows, and so I was able to be able to get close up and look at them and see what was being done. And I found out that a lot of it with Frazetta was painting these very thin washes and using the white of the board underneath to come through. Instead of adding white, he'd use the white of the board and take off paint or be thin with the layer of the paint to make it either brighter or put more paint on to make it darker. And so that was one of the main things that I learned was being able to manipulate, and this is oil paints, manipulate the oil to be like a watercolor technique, or be able to layer that. So I put it on a very thin layer first, let that dry, come on with another layer, let that dry, and then build up the opaques or build up the color on top of that.
Do you primarily use oils? Is all of this print stuff oils?
Correct. I use, right now, my particular style, I've introduced acrylics to the final stages of
Yes, I thought there was
painting.
some acrylic in there.
Right. So the beginning part of the painting is about 80% oils. I'm laying on layers, I'm laying on colors, using the transparency of the paint to keep the vibrancy. And that's where the vibrancy comes from, is I'm not mixing that paint out of the tube with anything to make it brighter. I'm using the white and the transparency of the paint and the board to keep the brightness that is coming out of the tube. So that's where those colors come from. And so as I'm working on the layers, I'm laying on backgrounds. I'm building up color tones, textures, making the darks opaque, and then once I get to a point where I start adding all the fine details that bring that character or vehicle or background to life, I change to acrylic. Because at that point I'm basically doing the same thing with oils, but the acrylic will dry quicker, so I can move faster.
And it's easier to manipulate.
And it's easier to manipulate. If I lay down a wrong color, I don't have to worry about trying to wipe it off and then smearing it. I can just paint right over it.
Right.
So there's some ease of technique during that last 20% of the painting. And because I paint very thin with the oils, the texture of the gesso underneath, the board underneath, gives that acrylic something to hold on to. I'm not painting very thick impasto style oil paint, which makes that waterproof barrier. So the acrylic is able to stay on. And then, as a final touch, I'll take out my markers and maybe just darken up some lines or darken up some shadows. I'll take some color pencil and just add a little bit of flair, some cross-hatching here, something to take it more from a painting to an illustration, if you understand the difference.
I think I do. Can I ask you a couple more questions?
Sure, absolutely.
So, your classic Dark Horse Star Wars and Aliens covers, how big are the originals? Are they the same size as these prints, which are about 11 by 14?
Yeah, the prints here on the table are 12 by 18. And the majority of the paintings that I did during that period were about 14 by 20. So not significantly larger than the prints you see here on the table. 14 by 20 is a very comfortable size for me to work on because I work on a drawing board. I don't paint on an easel. I paint on a drawing board. So if the board that I was working on was very big, I tend to sort of turn the painting sideways sometimes. I'll turn it upside down to work on areas, things like that. So I'm constantly maneuvering the board, and if I make the board too big, then it's going to be, knocking stuff off of my side table, hitting brushes or knocking over, stuff on the side. So just during my early years of painting, I came to a size that 14 by 20, 16 by 20 was a comfortable size for me to work on. 16 by 20 is a little bit wider proportionally than a comic book. The 6.5 by 10 and a quarter, I found that the 14 by 20 is proportional. Gotcha. So that gives me a good ratio to work with without having to worry about, all of this side is going to be cropped off or that side is not going to show when it gets printed. I know pretty much what it's going to look like as I'm working on it.
Do you do many versions, or do you just kind of work on one version? I believe Frazetta did do like kind of pre-done roughs and stuff.
Preliminaries, yeah. Some artists work with preliminaries. I don't, for the most part. I do a lot of drawing with felt tip pens, so I'm doing composition drawing. I'm doing tonal drawing. I'm figuring out where everything goes, and as I'm doing that, and then as I get into the drawing, because I do a fairly tight drawing before I do the painting, I'm painting it in my head. So as I'm drawing, I'm figuring out, okay, there needs to be some texture here when I start the painting. There needs to be a red explosion over here, or there needs to be some cool shadows on this area because I'm going to be putting in some rocks or something like that. So I have the painting pretty much finished in my head when I finish the pencil drawing. So after I transfer the pencil onto the board and spray fix it to seal it, instead of having, 2 or 3 roughs on the side that I'm referring to like a lot of artists do, it's all in my head. So really, I'm just at that point throwing paint on the board according to what I think the painting should look like. And I'd say about 85 to 90% of the time it comes out looking like I have in my head, and sometimes it doesn't. And that's one of the nice things about the oils, is you can wipe the whole thing off and start fresh. With acrylics, you can't, because once it dries, you can't do anything with it.
Right.
But with oils and the way that I paint, with the transparent and thinner layers underneath, I can wipe it off and still have that pencil drawing underneath, so I can see what I'm doing.
Did you do much wiping off?
No, I don't. Like I say, it's 85 to 90%.
You got it done.
Yeah, I know exactly what I'm putting down, and there'll be an occasional change here and there, but like big areas, no, usually that's all worked out prior to putting the paint down.
I've got an old prelim of yours at home, and I don't own the final finished one. It's like, I forget what it's called. It's called like Dragon Force or something. Do you remember these? It's like fighters and there's a dragon behind.
Yeah, big dragon. And one of them has a minigun, and one of them has a flamethrower, I think.
Yeah, that's it.
Right, yeah, that was a gaming cover.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Right.
I bought it from George Hagenower, who was selling some of that stuff.
Yeah, George is one of my art dealers, and
and so I saw online I saw the picture of the finished, and I bought the prelim, and they were pretty close. They were,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's just the way I work. Once I knock out all the compositional drawings and tonal drawings, they're usually just on sticky notes, so that's how small they are.
Yeah.
So when I get into the larger preliminaries, I usually pretty much know what I'm going to do, and that helps me get the photographic reference that I need as well. So I get my people to come over and pose, fake the costumes, get the the minigun and flamethrowers. I'll search my reference for samples for that, and that's the point. I pull everything together so that when the drawing is done, the final drawing, that's representative of the more realistic look that I go for.
How long does it take you to do one of those classic Star Wars covers?
The paintings generally are 5 to 7 days, depending on
full days, like 8-hour work days?
Well, no. Okay, for when I start, once I get the approval on my my rough, it takes me about a day to do the actual pencil drawing. So that's the first day. The second day, I transfer it to the board, and then I start laying on the background. And because it's a series of layers that I'm putting on, I have to wait for those layers to dry before I can get back onto it.
Got it.
So I'll do a layer, and that may take an hour, and then I'll set it off to dry for 4 or 5 hours, and I'll be able to come back.
Do you work on multiple paintings then? Do you switch to something else?
No, I really can't spread my attention that way. I've tried it before, and I just sort of lose track of the end result because my attention is split between projects. So I usually like to do just one project at a time. So when I'm not doing putting on the background, I'm waiting for it to dry, I'm usually just sketching or just doing something else artistically until I get to that point where I can work on the painting again. And so in a day I can maybe do 2 or 3 layers, and then usually by the second day, if I need a little bit more background, I'll do it. Then if not, then I'll start on the actual physical elements of the painting. And then, so we're looking at maybe 3 hours on the first day, and maybe 3, 4, 5 hours on the second day. When it gets to the third day, that's when I start putting in a little bit more intensive work. I'm working, 6 hours, 8 hours at a time, just sitting down and just working until, it's time for dinner, or I got to do something around the house. And then that's how it is until the painting is finished. So
cool.
There are, it's a couple of hours at the beginning, and then it's like a roller coaster. It starts out slow, and then more time is put on it as we get to the end of the painting.
I'm just looking at some of these lightsaber blasts and stuff. Are you using the computer now, or are you still very much a handcrafted kind of artisan?
For the original artwork, I do paint it, because obviously I can't put what's in Photoshop onto the painting.
Yeah.
That's all electronic. It's all ones and zeros. So when I do the painting, I actually paint the lightsabers on, the blasts, the laser blasts. But when I finish the painting, I'll bring it into Photoshop, and I'll do the lightsaber and the blasts in Photoshop, because it gives a more film realistic look to that part of the painting.
And brings attention to it too, I think.
Yeah, because there's a lot of heavy texture in there. There's a lot of sharpness and a lot of things going on, and then with the laser blasts and the lightsabers, it's all light, and so the softness that I can get in the Photoshop, I can't really achieve getting the light refraction and the softness of what a light can do in the paint. So,
cool.
So I mean, it may be hard to tell when you look at the originals from a distance, but when you get up to them, you'll see that it's a little sloppier than what the print was, because the print would have that electronic lightsaber put into it through Photoshop.
So just as a way of ending, I'll ask you to talk about any upcoming projects, anything you're excited to do. Are you mostly still working with Dark Horse, or are you doing a few other things?
I work with Dark Horse occasionally, doing the occasional cover here and there. I'm still working with Marvel, doing the occasional Star Wars cover here and there.
Yeah.
No regular projects with them. I'm doing a number of small press books. Depending on when this podcast is going to be, I've just done a variant cover for Action number 1000, my first big Superman painting. So that was a lot of fun, because I've done Superman a couple times for trading cards, but those are always really small paintings and not the dynamic, typical Superman that is from my childhood. So,
right.
So with this cover, it came out great, and I'm looking forward to seeing that printed.
I've got to ask, do you think your art has changed over the years?
Oh, yeah, certainly. I'm always...
in terms of composition?
Every painting is different. There's challenges to each piece, whether it's composition, color, or texture. Something in it that I do challenge myself to try to do better.
Yeah.
And I think that a real artist will do that. I've seen artists be very satisfied with the work that they do and then just stagnate. They do the same thing over and over again. Well, I've been doing Star Wars for, over 20 years. I'm still excited about doing it, and I don't really think that I've copied myself or done the same type of thing. Mm-hmm. It's certainly the same characters, but I try to approach it with the knowledge of what I've done in the past and try to push it in a direction that I haven't approached before.
Thank you so much. This has been great, and I really do respect your talent.
Oh, thank you very
and abilities.
much.
Yeah,
it's the greatest job in the world, and I'm glad to share it.
It's Koom for Deconstructing Comics. I'm at the Toronto Comicon, March 18th, 2018. I'm here with Howard Mackie at his table as people come by, and we're going to talk a little bit about his tenure at Marvel. How are you, Howard?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, I love the bullpen of the 80s and the early 90s, partly because it was kind of that renaissance under Jim Shooter's time, and also the early 90s is sort of when I was in high school collecting stuff. So I read your Ghost Rider, and I collected many of those issues with Mark Texeira and Javier Salteras, and I hadn't grown up with Johnny Blaze, so like for me Danny Ketch was. I would just love to hear stories, and I've heard a couple in the panels that I've attended with you about your time there. Like, for example, today you were talking about when Jim Shooter would throw issues on your desk and say, like, trees died for this.
Yes.
So any stories you could tell. And I also want to ask you about the writing process. You talked a little bit about how you got into Marvel on the panel yesterday. I'd love to hear about becoming a writer, the difficulties in being a writer and or editor, what you think about the market now and the situation now. So okay. I don't know where you want to start off.
Well, no, where do you want to start?
All right, let's talk about you said that I think it was Mark Grunwald invited you to apply for a job at editorial.
Okay, I'll start how I got started. I had no background in comic books before working in comic books.
You were a reader and a writer, presumably.
Oh, yes. No, I was a reader of comics, but my profession at the time was I was working for an exporting company. And I really was not having a lot of fun at the job, but I was good friends with Mike Carlin, who was working as an assistant editor at Marvel at that time. He went on to become an editor, and they eventually became an editor at DC Comics, and eventually the editor-in-chief at DC Comics. But Mike and I grew up together, and he was tired of hearing me complain about my job in the exporting company, so he suggested I apply for his job when he got promoted at Marvel as Mark Grunwald's assistant editor.
Now, let me ask you, do you think you would have got that job anyway, or do you think Carlin kind of shooed you in for the job?
Carlin, he's told me he definitely did not shoo me in. I went through the same process that everybody else did. What he gave me was the awareness that the job was available.
What was that process? Like, this would be the early 80s?
Yes.
What did Marvel expect?
Marvel didn't expect anything. It was up to the individual editors, and it was Mark Grunwald. And I've explained to people in the past, I would say the biggest issue, the biggest requirement was that an editor and their assistant shared an office that was about 10 by 10, maybe 10 by 15. And so you worked in very close quarters. And it was basically a personality test. You wanted to make sure that whoever your assistant was somebody that you could spend an entire day with. and then after that, one had to be relatively bright, literate, and then just willing to do the work. And I mean, at the very beginning, my major job was, making photocopies of artwork and scripts as they came in, and then making sure everybody, all the talent received the pages that they should receive. And then gradually I was trained more and more into the role of an editor, proofreading and dealing with the creators in terms of the writing process, because we would frequently go out with the writers once a month or so, go out to lunch just to talk story ideas and where the stories would go. So that's how I broke into Marvel.
So it wasn't a very top-down kind of thing at the time.
No.
There were like pockets of people, of creative teams working on stuff.
Yes.
What about when Secret Wars hit? You would have been like front and center, right?
I was actually not on staff when Secret Wars started. I came in to Marvel right in the middle of Secret Wars 2. I started in 1984.
Okay.
Secret Wars, I think, was 82, perhaps.
It can have been, because I sort of remember Secret Wars being mid-'80s. Am I totally remembering that wrong?
Yeah. I started in 84, and we were working on Secret Wars 2.
Wow. Okay, sorry. My apologies.
That's okay. I read Secret Wars, because I was getting comics from Mike Carlin at the time.
Yeah. So, do you have any interesting stories about like your early tenure at Marvel, and then we'll move to?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no. We'll cover some of the stuff that you had asked about. I mean, yeah, it was a fun time to work at Marvel because, again, as you said, it was not top down. We were not. Yeah,
and let's maybe name some of the personalities.
Yeah, no, I absolutely will. But for instance, my first day when I started at Marvel, Mark Grunwald had me be taken around the office to learn the process of making a comic. And some of the names are not going to be names that most of your listeners will be familiar with, but the gentleman who was in charge of the bullpen at the time, the production manager, was named a guy by the name of Danny Crespi. And Danny Crespi was a longtime letterer of comics, lettered Jack Kirby and that kind of thing. And Danny knew everything about how a comic book was put together. And Danny walked me around the bullpen, and there was another gentleman named Maury Kuramoto and a gentleman named Jack Abel, all of whom worked in early Marvel Comics as inkers and such. And they told me face to face how to do a comic book. And then I was taken to John Romita Sr., who was our art director, and he gave me pointers on things. So that was my introduction to. But yeah,
you were learning to be an editor, not a writer at that time.
Yeah, no, this was strictly editorial. It was about how comics are done. And Jim Shooter was the editor-in-chief. Tom DeFalco was his executive editor. But and then I worked with a lot of people on staff at the time. That Ann Nesenti was the X-Men editor, and then she went on to write a great run on Daredevil.
I love her Daredevil run, personally.
Yep.
I know people complain.
But it was different, and that's, I think, what was required.
But that's what was great about the 80s and Marvel.
Yes.
You had these talents that really shone through. Yeah.
And in the office on one side of our office was Denny O'Neil, who was an amazing Batman writer, and then went on.
What was he doing at Marvel at the time?
He was an editor. And he was writing Iron Man.
Okay.
And we will get back to his writing of Iron Man in a little bit. But then on the other side was Larry Hama.
And David Michelini would have been around there?
Well, he was a writer. He was never on staff.
Right.
So, yes, he was doing work for us, and I got to work because we worked. One of the books that Mark Grunwald edited and I was the assistant on was the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. And so I got to immediately meet a million artists.
Did you do the version in the around 1990? Which I think was a sequel to that?
Well, no, I think it was a little earlier. I think your timing is a little off. The early version of the official handbook was, again, I think,
that I know was 80s,
early 80s. And then shortly thereafter was in 1984. When I started, we were doing the sequel to it. Then later on, they had the card things.
The only reason I ask is because I have a page by Keith Pollard of Catman, in profile, and it's got a note on there, and it says 91% done, Jim. And my understanding was that was done in 1990, and I was trying to figure, if it's not Shooter, because Shooter would have been gone by then, was it Jim Salicrup that was...
I almost feel like Salicrup was gone too at that point, wasn't he?
Anyway, never mind.
Yeah, okay.
I'm just trying to figure this out.
But, so I was working with John Byrne and Walter Simonson and Al Milgram and John Buscema, Sal Buscema. I met Howard Chaykin briefly then. I mean, you name, Bill Sienkiewicz.
Frank Miller.
I barely touched bases with Frank Miller, but Bill Sienkiewicz, they were they were all up at the offices at the time, coming in and out.
They had to collect their paycheck.
Well, that was it. Collect their paycheck or to drop off the invoices so that they would eventually be able to collect their paycheck.
They wouldn't drop off art, too?
Yep. Everybody, if you were in the New York area, you would always drop off the work rather than mail it because it bought you a little bit more time, and then you could hand the invoice in at the same time.
Got it.
So
that's good.
Yes. So, but that everybody was up there, and we became friends. We hung out, and it was fun.
Okay, so it was a good time.
Yep.
You transitioned at some point into writing.
Yes.
Did you miss being on the other side of the fence? I mean, I would assume that you'd have a bit more control on editorial as opposed to being a writer.
Well, you would assume that.
And when did you transition?
Well, I transitioned, and this ties into the Denny O'Neil story. I was an assistant editor still for Mark Grunwald, and we were editing the Iron Man book.
Yeah.
And Denny O'Neil was writing it, and then Denny had a falling out with Jim Shooter, who was the editor-in-chief, and he was fired.
Okay.
And his storyline in Iron Man was unfinished, and the person that was going to take over was David McCrea, but there was going to be a gap issue between when David started, and he had no interest in finishing Denny's story.
Right.
So Mark Grunwald said we were having a conference about it, and he said, we need to find somebody to finish Denny's story before David takes over. And I said, yep, I agree. And he says it needs to be somebody who is familiar with the continuity and can pick it up right away. And I said, I agree. And he said, it needs to be you. And I said, no. And he said, Howard, you're mistaking that with a request. You're going to write this story, because he felt it was important as an editor to know what it felt like to be on the other side of the desk.
And just to understand, this was a duty. This was not something like, I'm going to pay you extra as a freelance writer.
Oh, no, I did get paid for it.
Okay.
No, I did, because I went through the entire process, because he wanted me to know what it would feel like as a freelancer, because he felt that would help my job as an editor. Because if I knew what somebody was experiencing on that side of the desk, it would only give me more information as an editor.
Was this the time when Romita Jr. and Bob Layton were drawing the title?
No. At that point, who was drawing? I think it was Luke Ross. I got to say goodbye to Howard Chaykin.
We'll be in touch.
Yeah, absolutely.
And absolutely great weekend. Absolutely. High point of the tourist.
I agree.
We'll see.
Take care.
That was Howard Chaykin.
I think Luke Ross was the penciler on Denny's run of Iron Man, but
my question was, did they have any issues with the transition?
No.
Or were they just kind of given scripts and they were like, all right, let me draw and here's my voucher?
No. What happened with me is I did one issue with Alex Saviuk. Iron Man number 211 was my writing job. And then the next issue would have been David McCrea with Bob Layton.
So they completely changed teams.
Yes,
it was a complete change.
Yes, and that's typical.
Okay,
that's typical. But it was at that point it was McCrea and Layton, and I'm drawing a blank on who was inking Layton. He might have been inking himself at that point.
So I have a couple of questions for you. One, did you find it hard to wrap up Denny O'Neil's storyline in one issue and to sort of follow what he was doing? And two, can I ask, what was the falling out between him and Shooter about?
I honestly don't remember what the falling out was. They had some issues going through, and I mean, and that happens at times.
And
I think
happen a lot with Shooter, because he was apparently very difficult.
Towards that time, it was becoming more and more so. I mean, I learned. I actually don't have a lot of negative things to say about Jim Shooter, because I learned a lot from him. I think he was an incredibly positive influence on the comic book industry. And like I said, it was not my.
That was my Marvel, and I loved it.
Yeah, and it wasn't my argument with Shooter, so I don't really remember what the details were.
Right.
But that was how I broke into comics at that point. It broke in terms of writing, and once that was published, I remember Jim Shooter coming down to the office with the issue. and putting it down on my desk as an assistant, and he said, it's not Shakespeare, and it should be, but it's a very good first effort. So, and then after that, other editors started approaching me to write more. And I did quite a bit of writing while I was still on staff at Marvel, first as an assistant and then as a full editor. It was once I got regular monthly series that I started to consider leaving staff.
Got it.
And then it was after the birth of my first daughter and soon to be birth of my second daughter.
So you could write
I
from
wanted
home.
to be at home.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you didn't get the bug right away. It didn't bite into you and you go, oh wow, I've got my credits on this and it's printed. No.
No, I also liked having a job that had health insurance and benefits, and I wasn't
Which
sure.
being a freelance writer did not.
Yes, well, except when by the time I went off staff, I was at that point I had the regular ghostwriter title, and I was offered a regular gig on Spider-Man, which would be would be enough for me to
Sorry, which
live
Spider-Man
on.
again?
What's that?
Which Spider-Man were you
It
on?
was Web of Spider-Man.
Web of Spider-Man.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what happened was Marvel, when I told Tom DeFalco, who at that point was editor-in-chief, that I was interested in leaving staff, he offered me a contract. And the way a contract worked at that point was basically none of my benefits changed. I just got to work at home. I still had to earn the money, but
You did it by writing instead
I did
of
it by writing instead of working at home. But I had full medical benefits, and I even got vacation time. So it was a dream job.
Yeah. So let's talk about you moving from, getting a few stories here and there in the wake of that Iron Man story to you getting to the Ghost Rider stuff. So what happened in between there?
Well, as I said, I just continued to do more and more writing.
Were there any long arcs or stretches of things?
I did a little run on a book called Chuck Norris and His Karate Commandos. I was asked to do that. It was a licensed project because I was a student of martial arts, and so they wanted somebody that had some knowledge of the material. And then I did another licensed project called Air Raiders, and then I did a lot of I did a Power Pack fill-in, and I did things here and there. And then ultimately, Marvel was looking Tom and Mark decided they wanted to explore the possibility of bringing Ghost Rider back. And
what year was this when they were knocking out?
It would have been 80. Well, it would have been 89 when they decided they wanted to bring the book back. I think maybe 90. And
I feel that by 90 it was already out.
No, it was because it was part of a promotion called Heroes for the 90s or something. So it was either 90 or 91.
Okay.
But I think I started working on it, developing it late 89.
Right.
And then Mark knew, because we worked together, I was always a big fan of Ghost Rider, Johnny Blaze. And he said, we're looking to bring the book back. We're soliciting for pitches. Why don't you pitch? And I said, okay, sure, why not? And so I worked on a pitch. What I didn't realize was that there were actually a number of other creators that had been approached at the time. And had I known, I probably wouldn't have pitched it because many of them were more established creators, one of whom was Bob Layton.
Right.
And I decided, but I didn't know that, so I just worked on what I wanted to do. And the only caveat that I was presented with was it could not be Johnny Blaze. It had to be all new character, all new origin. And that was a little frustrating for me because I was a big Johnny Blaze fan.
Right.
So what I did with that was, one of the common maxims you hear about writing is write what you know. That's what I did. I grew up, the Ghost Rider series is set in Cypress Hills, Brooklyn. That's where I grew up. It's takes place in cemeteries. I hung out in all those cemeteries as a kid because Cypress Hills, Brooklyn is all cemeteries.
Well, what I remember being in high school was there's also a band, like a rap group called Cypress Hill, that became really famous at the same time.
Yeah, but I think they came later, and I think there's a.
I'm sorry if I'm getting the times wrong.
No,
it's just been so long for me.
They did come later, but I think they're named after. I think there's a section of California or Los Angeles that's called Cypress Hill, so it's
okay. So they're not the same.
Yeah, not connected at all.
Okay.
Because I remember being turned on to.
Because yours is Cypress Hills.
Yes, yes, and they're Cypress Hill, right?
Right.
Yes, no, this is Cypress Hills, Brooklyn is all cemeteries. As a matter of fact, one of the interconnecting cemeteries in that area is where Harry Houdini is buried. There's a seance every year on the day that he died to see if he'll communicate from beyond.
So that works really well for Ghost Rider, because from what I remember of your Ghost Rider, and it's been a long time, so forgive me.
Yeah.
He comes out of the ground, doesn't he?
It was in I created some place that doesn't exist behind the cemetery, which was a junkyard, and that's where the motorcycle is buried in the junkyard. And it's kind of like a little cave of junk. He finds the motorcycle, and it's covered in blood.
Kind of like Stephen King's Christine.
Yep. And and then there's the glowing gas cap, and that's how he transforms into Ghost Rider for the first time. But it was all based upon places that I grew up in, and even the characters that even Danny Ketch is some weird version of me, and many of the supporting
What about his
cast.
girlfriend, the Cobb? What was her name? Barb or something?
Yep. Well, no, the sister was Barb. The girlfriend was Jill. No. Oh shoot! You think I would remember?
Yeah.
I remember her last name was Stratton.
She was very pretty. I had a crush on her.
And they were all. Here's one of the first things that Mark Grunewald taught me about creating characters. Don't ever give a character anybody's full name, okay? Don't name it after somebody you like, because if you do, eventually, you don't own the character when you give it to Marvel. Somebody else is going to come along and potentially do something really nasty to that character. So characters that I named in those books with friends or relatives' names, they were always mixed.
Gotcha.
Nobody ever had the same first and last name that they had.
Gotcha. Okay, so many questions I want to ask. Did other people who made pitches to Ghost Rider, were they upset? Do you think Marvel was doing this in a way that was like purposely clandestine to sort of control the...
It's a standard practice. Even today, it can be done that way. I don't know if they were upset or not, because I really only found out about the one. I don't know who any of the others were. I only happened, and the only reason I know that it was Bob Layton is that I saw the stack of pitches, and Bob Layton never typed. He always hand wrote his stories out, his pitches out on yellow legal paper.
Right.
And so I saw the stack of pitches, and one of them was handwritten in yellow legal paper. So that's why I know that it was Bob Layton.
So did you ever talk about it with Bob?
No, not at all. I mean, it happened. I've had pitches that I've done for other books that people asked me to do, and I didn't get it. It just happens. Then you move on to something else. I think probably shortly thereafter, after I got Ghost Rider, I think I hired Bob Layton to come back and write Iron Man. We knew what the game was. The only side effect to it would have been, had I known they were soliciting to so many people at the time, I would have said no. I was the one that was under the mistaken impression that I was the only person, and it almost didn't. And I've told this story before. The project almost didn't happen, because at that point, the sales department started to get involved in approval of new projects, and they felt like a project with what was perceived as a failed character, Ghost Rider, because there was not a regular book anymore, because his previous run had been canceled due to low sales. Teamed up with an untried writer. I was not somebody who had written anything on a consistent basis, and the art team of Javier and Texera were new and untried as well.
Right.
They felt it would never sell.
Right.
And so they threw roadblock, and that's why I said I started developing it in 1989.
Right.
I had to keep retooling it because the sales department kept asking for something different. And every time they wanted something different, I had to change the entire thing. Until Tom DeFalco finally told them, no, we're doing this, and I'll take the blame if it doesn't work. And it was published, and it sold better than the X-Men.
Yes, and it was a great book. At least I remember at the time. A big draw for me was sort of like the gritty texture of the art, but the stories were very engaging too. But it sounds like it was something like the 5th iteration of what you've done. So that leads me to a big question, which is, during the 80s especially, there's a growth of like this sort of auteur, and you had auteur personalities who were artists, you had auteur personalities who were writers, and you had some who were writer-artists like Miller, Simonson, Byrne, and so on. Do you see yourself as not really in that vein, but somebody who's been sort of like a company man who like went into Marvel because you hated your previous job, and then you sort of grew into the needs of what was necessary and went from job to job? Or do you kind of see yourself as kind of a writer with a particular identity, like some of the other writers? Because some of those have really strong identities and styles.
That's the first time anybody's ever asked me that question, and it's a great question.
Thank you.
And B, I consider myself more the latter. I was not an auteur, and I feel like I did grow into having an identity through Ghost Rider, but I think part of my longevity at Marvel in particular was that I was more or less adaptable, and editors like to work with me.
Sure.
And that I could take their vision for a particular book or a storyline, and I could make it my own while not shying away from what they wanted to do. The company man, if you say it that way, it's a little bit of a negative, but that was really my bread and butter. Editors really liked working with me.
Yes.
Because I would work with them and not just say, oh, here, this is what I'm giving you, and just do it. And I was able to, even as an editor, I got to work with John Byrne in particular, and editing is an art form when it's done right. And the best editors I've worked with and I tried to learn from are the guys that would feed you ideas without you knowing they were feeding you ideas, and then when the book came out with the real, the realization of those ideas that they fed you, they would never take credit for it. They would say they would love what you did with the idea, and that's all they would talk about. It's an art form that has been lost in comic books for the most part.
But it is a very corporate technique, and it's particular to Marvel corporate as opposed to like the corporate world. But it is a management technique.
Yes, but what I'm saying is all of that has changed over the years, because now it's a much more top down.
Yes,
and it's much more equivalent of Hollywood, where there are many people that get their hands on a project, and they all, in order to justify their position, feel they have to change something, and that I'm seeing more and more at the big two right now.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you're sort of part of the last generation of people in comics who worked in comics, who weren't really just producing something that was a merchandising tie-in. Around the time I stopped collecting comics, it would have been, right after all of that image crap, but it was also the idea that it was now fodder for Hollywood.
Yep.
And then, the comics were just there to sort of like, they were the stilts upon which the wharf was built.
Yeah.
And it was, but anyway.
It's research and development. It's R&D. That's what it is. And DC got there before Marvel did. DC, they didn't realize it as much, although they had if you think about it, Batman and Superman franchise, they were the only decent comic book movies.
They sold the rights to Swamp Thing for nothing, right?
Yeah, as Marvel did, but Marvel sold the rights to everything for nothing, is now just gradually grabbing some of it back.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, just to add to what you were saying, like, you sort of like drifted into this as a job, and it's kind of like, it's not just comics, it's also music, it's also TV. These things that people kind of took to as workmen before, now have become these glamorous, attractive industries. And the same thing with comics. Like, I listened to your experience, and I would like, I would give like my eye teeth to be there, right? But like, you just sort of drifted into it, whereas now, because
also,
of that,
I didn't plan on it being a career.
That's right.
Just,
That's right. And you're not the only one who says that.
I did it to get out of the job.
Yeah.
It paid me nothing.
Yeah.
I had to take a salary cut to work there, and I thought, okay, I'll stay there for a little while. And two things happened. One, I walked into that office the first day as an assistant editor, and there was a young woman sitting on the couch in Mark Grunwald's office, and I thought she was very attractive. I wound up dating her, marrying her, and we've been together for 34 years. So that was one thing. And two,
what was she doing on his couch?
She worked in a different department at Marvel. She was in the licensing division,
right.
And their job, she had to she was one of the few people on. At that time, Marvel editorial and the creative people were all on the 10th floor, and all the business people were on the 11th floor, and there was a staircase that ran between, and she was one of the few people that ever used the staircase on a regular basis, because she was responsible for getting artwork to use on like t-shirts and games and things like that. And Mark Grunwald was the continuity guy amongst Marvel. He was the continuity king. So, and because we were doing the handbook, we had all the still shots that she could use, and so that's why she was there. And she was friends with Mark as well.
Coming up, more with Howard Mackie, including his experience at Marvel with the guys who would go on to form Image, and what Howard did after leaving Marvel. Also, John McCrea on working with Grant Morrison, and more.
Are you willing to follow me on a journey and risk getting lost in a swirling maze of past ages, protected only by our red indestructible capes as we break through the final unexplored realm of the time barrier to explore the fantastic Silver Age adventures of the world's greatest hero, Superman? If so, join me each week on the Superman Fan Podcast, as together we'll follow the Man of Steel, his cousin Supergirl, and his closest friends, Perry White, Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, Lana Lang, Batman and Robin, and others in Superman's never-ending quest to defend truth and justice in the pages of Action Comics, Superman, World's Finest Comics, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, and Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane. Go to the supermanfanpodcast.blogspot.com, available on iTunes and most other podcast aggregators. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Medium, Flipboard, and Stitcher. And after you listen, feel free to send email to supermanfanpodcast@gmail.com. And unless you request otherwise, I look forward to reading your comments on future episodes. And don't forget to wear your red indestructible cape, standard safety equipment for traveling through the time barrier.
It's DCP In Touch, where we hear from our listeners. We got a comment on the blog post for episode 587, Science in a Comic, Dialogue About the Dialogues, from someone going by the name Spinal Cold, who writes, "Just wanted to say I really enjoyed this episode, and I'm glad you managed to get Clifford Johnson on to add some history to this comic, which I will be picking up. He is correct that there is a large overlap of science and comics, which should be obvious since both fall heavily under the nerd umbrella. I've always wondered why there weren't more comics that explained science, since it's the perfect medium for it. I'm guessing the time it takes to draw them is a large barrier, but I liked Clifford's story on how it was a struggle just to find a publisher. I suspect there are quite a few former scientists working in the field doing fiction, but I can only think of Matt Hawkins, the president of Top Cow Comics, who does a ton of science fiction and includes science write-ups in his books. Anyhow, I just wanted to write and say I enjoyed this episode. It made me go back and listen to some other science episodes you did with Ryan, like Manhattan Projects, and like him, I have a huge interest in this area of physics. Last, I am Canadian and get some of my comics through Amazon.ca. Is there a way to set up your Amazon deal with the Canadian store as well? Would like to help support that way. Thanks for your message. I found that Amazon has a system for linking users in selected countries to their own country's Amazon, and I've set this up for Canada. If you have an Amazon Canada account, try clicking on the Amazon banner on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com and see if it works, and let me know if it doesn't. By the time this episode goes up, I hope to have this set up for Amazon UK as well. And now back to Koom's talk with Howard Mackie.
All right, so I'm back with Howard Mackie. So we were talking about you being sort of a company man. And please don't take that in a pejorative sense, but I want to go to the early 90s and then the ascendance of people like Jim Lee, Eric Larson, Todd McFarlane, who were not company men at all. And so if you could talk to any of that stuff that was happening, I would love to hear about that.
Well, number one, they were company men until they weren't.
But there must have been tensions before they walked.
A little bit, but not at the beginning. I mean, if you think about it, Jim and Todd and Rob Liefeld, they and Eric, they all started the same way. They got their big breaks by working at Marvel. So for a long time they were a version of a company man, but then they realized that the sales were going through the roof, and
they were not getting the profits that they wanted.
They felt like they deserved more, and they did approach Marvel as a group and said, we would like to own part of the work that we do. We would like to share higher in the profits, and if we don't do that, we're going to go off. And Marvel wasn't willing to do it at that point, because until they did it, nobody had done it, and so it wasn't thought that it would be successful. So I don't know that it was a huge, it wasn't as bitter of a schism. They had an idea of what they wanted to do, what they could do. They made their case in a negotiation, and Marvel was unwilling, so they went off. And Marvel, I will say, the people that ran Marvel thought, well, these guys aren't going to do anything. And it turned out not to be the case. They were very successful. But I think Jim had a really good work. I know he had a good working relationship with Bob Harris, who was his editor at the time, because Bob and Jim.
Jim's supposed to be a pretty nice guy. Todd, not so much.
Todd. My understanding is it was Todd that instigated it, but why not? Sure. His was the first. His Spider-Man, blew the roof off of sales. So I don't know Todd. I don't know Todd, so I can't speak to his personality. I know his work, and I'm a big fan of his work. And I know Rob, and I like Rob, quite frankly. He's a really nice guy. I just ran into him not too long ago at a convention, and he was incredibly nice. And back when I was doing Ghost Rider, after they went off to do Image, I actually did a kind of a swipe at the Image guys with a group that I created called The Next Wave. This was before, later on, I think there was another one called The Next Wave. But all of the characters in that book, they were a group of villains, were based on the Image guys and some of their creations. And I ran into them shortly thereafter at San Diego Comicon. And Rob came running over to me, grabbed me, and shook my hand. Art, that was awesome! I loved what you did. It was not meant to be mean or negative, but why not? We make fun of each other. That's That's what you do.
And then you said after they left and then the implosion, it was pretty dark days because people were being let go.
Yes.
Was Ron Perlman kind of involved at that time? Was he running things, or?
I think it was after Perlman, because Perlman he was part of New World Studios. I think he bought us both at the same time, and I think it was after Perlman that it really started to tank, and that, or maybe when we were, and then we went in. Yes, he leveraged the company too much, and that's what put us into bankruptcy, Chapter 11, and then we were bought. Well, there was the fight between Perlmutter and Carl Icahn, and I think Icahn had us for a little while, but Ike Perlmutter is the one that won that battle, and he took over Marvel, and that was where most of the layoffs started really happening, and Perlmutter is ultimately the one that was able to sell it to Disney, and he made himself a boatload of money.
Right.
No.
But you were gone by, 2001?
2001 is when I wrote my last story.
And so what were you doing at the end before you left, and what did you end up doing after you left?
I had finished my contract out for Marvel, so right before that, so I had done Spider-Man up until that point. And then when I left, I took a break from comics for a little while.
Were you just burn out in terms of writing?
Well, not in terms of writing, but in terms of what was available in terms of publishing, and I was tired of playing the game. I was very fortunate in that my time at Marvel was very profitable for me, and so I was able to sock away quite a bit of money that gave me some breathing room. And then I started doing a bunch of consulting work for companies. I did some ghost writing versus ghost writing, but I did do a bunch of consulting work for companies in the U.S. but also abroad. There was a point a number of years ago, maybe almost 10 years ago now, that I was an editor-in-chief for a startup graphic novel company out of India.
What was that like?
It was interesting. It was a position I had no interest in originally. They had originally contacted me to see if I wanted to write some comics. They were mostly doing like classic illustrated adaptations of
mythology and stuff like
that. Or Moby Dick, or whatever literary works. And so that's what they contacted me for, and I thought, I'll think about it. And then they told me what the page rate was, how much they'd pay me, and I said, I won't even reread Moby Dick for that amount of money, so no harm. Thank you very much for the opportunity, but I think I'll pass. And for whatever, they had, all of the creators were creators out of the U.S., with some Indian artists. And then, they had hired a gentleman from the U.S. who I think had perhaps overly sold himself in terms of what his experience was. And he became their editor-in-chief. And he, for whatever reason, even though I had said I wasn't interested, he had like a weekly email blast that he sent to all the creators, and he kept my name on the list. And they would come to me, and I'd see it, and I'd just toss it right in the trash, because I wasn't doing work for them. And then one day I was bored, I guess, and I didn't have enough going on, so I read the email. And he was struggling with, many of the writers that they were working with had no experience writing comics at all. And they were comic fans, they were aspiring comic book writers, but they had never written.
But from the States, not from the
States, yes. And so he was struggling to convey to them a point about storytelling, and really about how to pace a story and how to break a story down so that it flows. And I read it, and I felt like he was struggling, wasn't doing a terribly good job doing it. So out of kindness, and because I was bored, I just wrote him like I think 1 or 2 page email about how I taught people and how I was taught about how to bring, and it's stuff that I couldn't do it unless I really sat down and described to you how I do it, because so much of it's internalized. I know the pacing of a comic book. I know the pacing of a page. And I know how many words can fit in the individual panel. And I put all of this stuff with some pointers on into this memo to him, and I sent it to him. And he thanked me, and that was great. And then what he did was he forwarded it to all of the writers that he was working with and to his boss, but he didn't. He didn't just. He did credit. That was the problem. He instead of copying and pasting it, which I would have been fine with, he just forwarded my email. So my name was on there, my email address was on there, and his boss contacted me and said, "I saw the memo you wrote to Sean. We need you.
Okay.
So let's talk." So we set up a call next day or whatever. We spoke, and we came up with a contract price that I would pay. And it wasn't a huge amount of money. I think if I was living in India, I would have been living very well.
Yes,
but
it was worth it.
It was something that, and I gave them some caveats on that, where I said, I'll do this, but I need absolute control over this, because I'm the one that knows how to do it. I know Sean has commissioned many projects. I'm going to read through them, send them all to me. I will read through them all, and if I don't think it's workable, you're telling me you'll let me pitch it. And they agreed to that. And I went through it, and there were many things I had to reject. There were a number of things where I asked the creators to make changes, and some of them were willing to work with me. A few of them argued against me. Actually, you were at the panel yesterday?
And today.
Okay, well, yesterday's panel, the moderator, Brent Chittington, he was one of the creators, and he was one of the few guys. I mean, there were a handful of guys that had serious talent, and he was one of them. And there are a few other guys, and they've gotten other work since then. And I had spent like 2 hours on the phone with Brent back in those days, and he was willing to listen, and he wanted to learn. So I worked with him, and there was at least one or two guys that said, "Oh no, I can't possibly do this unless you give me more pages. I can't tell a complete story without 90 pages." And I said, "Oh, you're talking to somebody whose entire career was based on complete 22-page stories, so you can do it. And if you won't do it, then we will." And that's my line of thinking is it's not a request.
Comes back to
yes.
You mistook this for...
That's right, you're mistaking this for a request. Yeah. I use that same line with my daughters as well in the old days. If I tell them to do something.
Are you waiting for Howard?
Well, I just wanted to say hello.
Hi, how you doing?
Sorry you didn't get more of a chance to talk during I was in the session there.
The second one, yeah. I knew that was likely with Chaikin there in particular, but Connor was a surprise as well. I usually am not at a loss for words, but the thing is, we were talking about stuff that the three of us do very different type of writing. And, my perspective and my experience is somewhat different than theirs. And I have quite a bit of respect for both of them. But I approach things somewhat differently, and certainly my experience in the industry has been different than theirs. I was both. I started as an editor, and then I was a
Marvel.
Yep. And so I know both sides of the table. I mean, Howard is much more knowledgeable about many things than I am. This little slice of things, absolutely. But yeah, Howard's a friend. We had dinner last night. We're both very opinionated. There's a little slender thread in there that he and I disagree on, because he does not have that same experience that I do. His experience is very, it's just very different than mine, and we were working with different people at different times. So,
but I also think you're very different personalities too.
Yeah, we are. You know what? Honestly, more similar than you. That's the thing that was fun about this. I've known Howard for 34 years. Have not spent any time with him until today, or till this weekend, and we were shocked at how well we got along. We have so many things in common, from people we knew to people we don't like, to where we were raised. We're both from Brooklyn. We both worked really hard at losing our accents. So there are very many similarities. We do tend to approach things a little bit differently in this narrow corridor. So, like I said, I was more surprised that I was getting more interrupted by the other gentleman on the panel.
He was figuring if he didn't get his voice in there, he would just be.
And what happened was there was a certain point where I just decided. I'm just gonna. No, I wasn't angry about it, but I was just gonna let them go for it. Yeah, I mean, I could keep trying to fight for airtime, but I don't see the point. So, well, thank you. Same here. Thank you.
So I should just ask you what you're doing now. I know you're antsy there.
Well, no. I'm working on a Ghost Rider project for Marvel that should be coming out later on in the year.
Does this build on your previous run?
It will involve Dan Ketch and other characters.
But is there continuity?
Not really. It's a one shot. It's a one shot right now, unless of course they love what I do, and then we'll see. But then I have a number of creator-owned projects in development. I've just started kicking all of that into gear. I have a number of artists. One phenomenal artist named Peter Kowalski from Poland. He's a European style artist, and he keeps saying, well, I'm going to try to make it more American style, and I say no, I love his style. He is a very strong horror artist, and that's the kind of story we're working on right now, when we have a number of publishers that want first look, and if they don't accept it, we'll either go the image route or we'll do a Kickstarter, and I don't think we'll have any trouble funding it. But then I'm doing a bunch of work currently for Zenoscope, which was interesting. They contacted me out of the blue, and they originally wanted me to do some editing for them. I'm not as interested in the editing right now, but I did agree to write some projects. But my colleague and friend Terry Kavanaugh, who was completely responsible for the Clone Saga idea, he took on the editing job for them. So he's actually my editor right now on the projects that I'm working for them. So yeah, that's basically what I'm doing right now.
And I'm guessing that dealing with Marvel, like say for this one shot, is very different from being at Marvel when you were there before. Like, I'm guessing you wouldn't even really go into the offices and work there.
No.
You would just do everything electronically.
Yes, and I mean, even back in the day, I was, once I went under contract for writing, I didn't go in, well, I did go into the office just because that's where all my friends were, and I lived close enough, but now I live far enough away that I don't need to go in. I do it all.
Are you still in New York?
I am in New York, but I'm about an hour and a half north of New York City. So unless they really need me to come in, everything can be done through emails from my end of it. We talk on the phone occasionally. It's a very different experience. It's Mark Basso. And Mark. Oh shoot! I just am drawing. It's a long day.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah. Anyway,
but it's very different, I'm sure.
It is. Well, and also,
you say there are a lot more.
I'm an older guy, so some of them know me. They know my reputation. Mark Panisha. I'm sorry. Mark Panisha is the senior editor. Mark Basso is is working with him on it, and they're really nice guys. They approached me. But even as I'm writing it, and it's some good notes I'm getting, and saying, well, you have to keep in mind some of the readers that will be reading this for the first time are not necessarily going to be familiar with your Ghost Rider work with Dan Ketch. So they're reminding me of that, which is good, because this has got to be a standalone project that we have to assume everybody is going to be it's going to be their first exposure to the characters.
I'm here with John McCrea, who's famous for Hitman, some collaborations with Garth Ennis, and some other things. How are you doing?
Not too bad, thanks. How's yourself?
Oh, good. Did you go out for St. Paddy's Day?
Yeah, we went out for a few drinks. Nothing too wild, I've got to admit.
It wasn't like Poland or some of the other stories?
No. I'm getting a bit old for all that, I think, possibly.
So I attended the panel with you yesterday, and I just love listening to the stories that you had, and I was hoping you'd share some about transitioning into the industry or just anything that...
Sure. Well, I started out living in Belfast in the 70s, growing up reading Marvel comics, and just wanted to be a comic artist from age 4, much to the sort of confusion of my parents, who couldn't understand how anybody from Belfast could end up being a comic artist for America, let alone just a comic artist at all.
Yeah.
So when I got to about 16, I opened a comic shop in the Belfast first comic shop. And
now, you talked about growing up during the Troubles.
Sure.
Was it hard to sell comics during the Troubles?
Was it hard? Well, by the time I opened the shop, the Troubles had eased off a little bit. It wasn't quite so tough.
But did people have disposable incomes to spend?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Oh, God, yes. I mean, the Troubles were there, but, people still had jobs and lives, and a lot of the time the Troubles never impacted on people at all,
Yeah.
People went around about their day-to-day life, all the same. So yeah, there was disposable income, and you could buy Marvel comics in newsagents very sporadically, very random, spotty distribution. There were a lot of the British reprints of Marvel comics as well, but they were all black and white, and they were...
That was my first one too, and I remember...
Right, okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, they were cool, but you yearn to get your hands on those American comics.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, we didn't have... I used to go to London a little bit, and I would go to places like Forbidden Planet and...
when you were a teenager?
Yeah, when Comic Showcase, and I wanted that as well. And I realized that Diamond distributors were the people to deal with. So my friend and I just talked to Diamond, realized we could, if we bought enough comics off them, we could open a shop and get set up. I had been working in a builder's yard and had some disposable...
So would this be the 80s then?
Yeah, early 80s by this point.
Yeah.
So realized I had some disposable income that I could use to help set up a shop. But we used to buy our punk records, my friend and I. We were both young sort of punks, and we bought our punk records from this guy called Terry Hooley, who ran a shop called Good Vibrations. And one day we were sitting around chatting with Terry about the idea that we were going to open a shop, and he just said, you can use my back room. If you clear that out, you can have it for free. And so our initial outlay was greatly reduced by Terry allowing us just to run a shop out of his back
Cool.
of his record shop. But the Troubles did, we did have people like local loyalist sort of paramilitaries coming into the shop and asking for donations to the cause and all this sort of malarkey.
So you were on the British side of the...
Well, yeah, I'm a Protestant, but I wasn't really on any side. I looked at it as just...
Sorry, I just meant geographically.
Was I on the... Yeah, I was in Northern Ireland, so, we're dealing with being that's a British... part of the British Empire, I guess. Protestant...
I've been there, by the way.
Yeah.
I was in Belfast last year.
Yeah,
I loved it.
Yeah, it's a lovely place. It has improved a whole lot. Since the Troubles have kind of died down, it's become a real tourist destination now.
Sure.
And, it's been voted one of the best places to visit in the UK, or in Europe, should I say. So it's really changed a lot over the years since I left, and since in the 80s and the 70s when I was growing up there. I couldn't wait to get the hell out of Dodge myself. I just wanted to leave. But while I was there, and while I had no way of getting around it, I figured I'd open a comic shop and make some money out of that, get cheap comics for myself, fuel my thing. But the advantage of opening the shop was that we had a lot of people coming in who knew I was sort of trying to break into comics and actually had started to get some work. And one of the guys was a fella called Garth Ennis, who used to come in and buy his copies of Concrete and Cerebus Office. And Garth just suggested to me.
He liked Concrete.
Yeah, he liked Concrete.
That's so funny because Concrete is like, I know, maybe my favorite thing.
Concrete's wonderful, isn't it?
And I think Ennis' stuff, I'm not a big fan. Nothing against him. I know he's hugely popular, and I read the whole Preacher run and I liked it. But he goes for a very blunt edge, you know, whereas Concrete is very thoughtful and.
Yeah, he can be. I mean, sometimes Garth will surprise you with quite subtle storytelling, but he does love his giving you a good scare or whatever and being quite obvious, I suppose, maybe.
Yeah. And you were saying yesterday in the panel that you'd grown up loving Marvel and those characters.
Oh, sure.
And so
I'm a huge fan.
Working with Garth must have been sort of like a 180 in terms of if you're coming from that sensibility.
Well, yeah, to a degree, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like I said, when I worked with him on The Punisher or something like that, and he kind of took the piss out of all the Marvel heroes.
Which Punisher storyline did you do?
Confederacy of Dunces, where basically. Spider-Man and Wolverine and Daredevil were all sort of trying to shut the Punisher down, but of course he was much smarter than all of them, and Garth really portrayed them as complete dummies, and it annoyed me because it wasn't the characters. That's not really the way Spider-Man is, and definitely not the way Daredevil is, and even not the way Wolverine is. They're actually quite thoughtful, intelligent characters. But Garth doesn't see that, and he doesn't. And so, it frustrated me that. But at the same time, working with him on The Boys, where he was ripping the hell out of superheroes, they were not established. He had created new superheroes, and that was fine. I had no problem with that, because superheroes intrinsically are ridiculous. It's a ridiculous thing. So it's fine to take the piss out of them. It's just that if you do it in the right way, and not with Spider-Man to just ignore his spider sense and make him quite a bit of a moron, when actually Pete Parker is a very intelligent kid, and he has good spider sense, so you can't ignore that. But that's neither here nor there. It was still a good experience, and working with Garth has always been a pleasure.
What's your process like? I mean, do you talk about directions and ideas, or? Yeah,
Garth he knows what he wants most of the time, and I honestly, it's enough of a slog producing a monthly comic without getting involved in the writing of it as well, so I just tend to let Garth get on with it. And there were a few things I would suggest that early on in Hitman that Garth put into the book, and we worked together on creating Section 8 to a degree, but for the most part Garth writes the story and I draw it, and that's the way it goes. He's a good. With other writers it's different, like with the guy Phil Hester, who I did Mythic with for Image. Phil's very collaborative, and there were bits of the story that I wrote and he wrote, and bounce back and forth, and I'm happy to do that as well if I can. But with Garth, he's got a strong personality, a strong voice, and he knows what he wants to say.
Right. So you're living in London now, is that correct?
No, I live in Birmingham, which isn't far from London.
Yeah,
it's
an
hour and a half up the road.
That's great.
And Garth lives in New York.
Right.
Now, so don't really bump into each other that much these days.
So after you and Garth got your approval to do that thing with the 2000 AD affiliate, how long before you moved to London or Birmingham?
It was maybe a year and a half or 2 years or something like that.
So once you and Garth collaborated, it was pretty much...
Well, I was desperate to get out of Belfast. It was not because of the troubles per se, but just because it was really...
Opportunities?
Well, not even that, because I had started to get my work, and I could travel back and forth to London, and go to conventions and go to the publishers and get more work that way. Just more that Northern Ireland was pretty boring. It was a very monocultural society.
Got it.
The kind of music I liked the kind of the things that I was into. There wasn't much of it there. It was in the early 80s. It was still very much rock music and such like that everybody listened to. And I was into reggae and soul and disco and punk and a little bit more variety. And I wanted to get to places where I could experience more of that variety and just be, just change, experience a little bit outside of the box of that. Now, so, that was more my reasoning for getting out of Belfast than that.
What's it like dealing with companies like Image or Marvel while being in Birmingham? Don't you want to come over to the States so you can be closer to those currents of opportunity?
There's no denying that if you do live over there, opportunities land on your lap a little bit more. If you're able to go into the DC offices once a week, jobs will appear that wouldn't appear when you're in Birmingham. But at the same time, when I was young, there was nothing more. I wanted more than to live in America. It just seemed like this exotic locale that you could go to, where all the superheroes were.
I grew up in the UK, and that myth was definitely there.
Totally, yeah. But now, the very idea.
Now I'd rather live in the UK personally.
Oh well.
That's but
I think I'd rather live in Europe or somewhere.
That's because you're going through Brexit.
Oh yeah, Brexit's we're morons. But there you go.
But in terms of the land and the culture and the history.
And also, there's that, and also because of our NHS. I mean, Jesus, to live in America and always worry about getting sick and ill and just is terrifying. Just the gun culture of America now just makes it, I've got kids. I don't want to be worrying sick about the fact that I'm going to send my kids off to school and then not see them again ever because they get shot by some lunatic. Sure. And I know it's not, it's a big population. It's not likely to happen. I grew up in Northern Ireland and people thought the same about Northern Ireland. I know exactly that feeling of that fear, but how it's probably not going to happen to you, but it's a much more likely to happen in the US than it is in the UK now, or in Europe, or in wherever. So the idea of living in the States is just no thanks.
I hear you.
Thanks. Canada, I love Canada. It's great.
Yeah.
But that's just the way. That's the way of these things. Yeah, you change your mind as you go along. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, any interesting stories that you can think of? I'll just give you free reign.
In what context?
In terms of the context of the comics industry, in terms of, I loved your story, for example, about them saying, well, the Vogue is painted comics, so you got to paint everything, and you just lied your way through it in your first job, then learned on the job. I love that. Anything.
Admit it, that is, you've got to adapt to what the industry throws at you, I guess, and I wouldn't recommend lying to your publishers about your capabilities or anything. But in that case, I was young and stupid. And
it's what you had to do.
And it seemed like
I think over here that's considered hustle.
It's called considered hustle.
Yeah,
fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough. I suppose you're right.
I love that story.
Yeah. Bless you. But yeah, it's. I've done a lot of stupid stuff in my career as well. I remember my first job for 2000 AD when Richard Burton was the editor, and I got a Future Shock for 2000 AD, which is a little 4 page story. And
Richard Burton from Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was the editor?
Yeah.
He must have been on hard times.
It was tough.
Elizabeth Taylor must have really kicked him in the nuts.
Oh, sure. How many times did they get divorced? He was penniless. He got me to do some character designs for the story, and I did very realistic characters, and I sent them in, and he was very pleased with those. So I got the script, and I started to draw it in this realistic style, and then I went, nah, forget it, and I just threw them aside and started drawing in this mega cartoony style. Really,
what was the subject matter?
It was called Time Flies, and it was about this guy who creates a time machine goes and robs a bank and then uses the time machine to get away, but he jumps into the future, but by the time he jumps into the future, the building he's in has been demolished and he plummets to his death. So it was an intrinsically stupid story anyway, but funny.
With a little twist.
Yeah, oh sure.
That kind of thing. Yeah.
That's what it's all about with the future shocks. And so I did it in this ridiculously over-the-top cartoony style with big feet and, crazy running and all this sort of business, and sent it in, and Burton rang me up and he just said, John, you've basically lied to me. You promised me one sort of style and you've delivered a completely another sort of style, and it's completely inappropriate to 2000 AD, I think. And if the deadline, if 2000 AD wasn't due to print like tomorrow, I would scrap this story and tell you to get lost. But I'm going to have to publish it. But you're not working for 2000 AD again.
Was that it?
Yeah. Well, it was it for me until Richard left 2000, and then a new editor came in, and I got back in again. But it wasn't a clever thing to do. Again, it was me being an idiot and just thinking, I can do this, and that there's going to be no repercussions. Of course there is. If you do something.
Well, why did you do it? Did you feel that was a more appropriate style? Did you feel it would be easier to do that? Were you having a lark? What was it?
It was all three of those things. Having a lark. Yes, I think I love comics as a medium, but
you want to have fun doing it.
But I want to have fun, and I just felt that I was going to enjoy myself more if I did it in that way. And I didn't think it was a particularly serious or cerebral story, so I didn't see the problem with that. And I mean, Burton was very much about everything being very realistic in 2000 AD, but as time went on, there were a lot. Jamie Hewlett came in and did very much cartoony sort of stuff and things. So I felt justified that what I'd done was not inappropriate.
You were ahead of the curve.
That's it, exactly.
Because that's where comics went.
I'm always ahead of the curve. Too misunderstood, and and just not. People don't realize my genius. That's it. Oh dear.
So I gotta ask, what's it like dealing with Garth? Because I would think that'd be a fucking nightmare.
No, God, no. No, what do you mean?
I don't know him, but sure. I read his stuff, and I'm just like, there's somebody else who contributes to our podcast who loves Garth Ennis, and his favorite Punisher is the Garth Ennis Punisher.
Right.
And he knows who I'm talking about. Sure. And I've read a ton of these just to try to get at what is the Garth Ennis thing. And I think, from whatever I've read, of his stuff, The Preacher, I feel, is the stuff I've enjoyed the most because it's the most personal.
Have you ever read Hitman?
I have not, and I'm so sorry, John.
Well, no, it's quite all right, but
I'm so sorry.
No, I mean, I'm not. You don't have to apologize for that. But what I think is that Hitman is actually a better book than Preacher. Nothing to do with my art. Yeah. I think Garth creates such sympathetic characters. Tommy and all his friends are such a really well-realized bunch of guys that it's and they're much more believable characters. I mean, the main character in Preacher, Jesse, is such a perfect sort of thing. He's handsome, he's tough, and he's good in a fight. He's good with women.
And
women
he sort of
love
does
him,
the right thing.
And he always does the
around.
he does. So he's this unattainable goal. Whereas Tommy, the main character of Hitman, he's a drinker, a smoker, he's a gambler, he's a fuck up. He's childish. He's a bit of a twit. And he's a much more believable and relatable character from that point of view, I think. But Hitman has got a whole lot of soul and heart that I find not quite so much in Preacher.
I'll give it a try because now that I met you, I wanna.
Yeah, but you have to give it until about. You have to get to about into the tens. The first couple of arcs are fine, but it really gets going once it hits about issue 10 onwards.
That's part of my problem with him. I find that the quality's very inconsistent. I find that sometimes he's just churning out stuff in that Garth Ennis style, and he gets away with it because people like seeing boot soles going to people's skulls, and and it's it's not even like cleverly done. Like you read something by Frank Miller or something. At least there's some kind of there's a signature to the violence.
Sure.
It's just a big joke to Ennis. I mean, I read his Hellraiser arc where Hellblazer, sorry, where it's set in Belfast, and I think the best aspects of that are the aspects of Belfast where you see the pubs and stuff.
Sure.
Like I have no attachment to the characters or the stories or whatever. I mean, I get the sense that he's a really miserable guy.
No, he's not at all. That's a funny...
Because his vision of the world is just like this...
Yeah, but he's not miserable at all. He's
industrial warehouse that's just like gone to shit, you know?
Well, actually... That's not...
No, okay, sorry, man.
That's not... No. That's not I would say that's a pretty accurate description of the way the world's going anyway.
Well, yes.
But Garth's not a miserable guy at all. He's a very happy punter, and he's got a great life, and he enjoys himself.
All right,
yeah. But I've always enjoyed working with Garth. I've known him for years. I've always enjoyed working with him. I may not have always 100% agreed with the sort of stories that he's doing or what have you. But that's his vision, and I'm not doing very much with. Well, I'm not doing anything with him now. I'm working with Jerry Duggan on Dead Rabbit, and that's really the book I'm doing at the moment. So I'm happy enough doing that, and Garth's happy enough doing his thing. I mean, everybody has their own thing.
So tell me about Dead Rabbit.
Oh well, it's just it's a crime, a noir crime sort of book. Set slightly in the future in Boston in America, and we have a ex-gangster guy who comes out of retirement because his wife is seriously ill and he can't afford the health care, so he's fucked by the hospitals.
That's a great premise.
Yeah.
Is that Duggan's or yours?
Duggan's. Oh, it's Duggan's. Oh, yeah, it's his thing. Yeah, totally. Yeah. And he's fucked by the healthcare. He's screwed by. His wife has to go into hospital, and he gets these bills that he has no way of paying, so he has to go back to work. And it's I think it might be the first time that there's been so much. Jerry's very passionate about how America and the healthcare system and the general political system is just basically ass fucking America, and the working and middle classes of America are being completely obliterated by what's going on at the moment and the way it just inevitably seems to be going. So, but we've got our hero who's a very sympathetic guy, and he's always been a pretty good guy. He tries not to hurt anybody who doesn't deserve hurting.
So he's kind of in the mold of those kind of like working class gangster heroes from London, kind of like the Cockney Michael Caine kind of.
Yeah, he's in that sort of element. I mean, the one sort of kind of premise, sort of extra special premise that the thing has is that he's descended from the Dead Rabbits were one of the toughest gangs of New York.
Yeah.
And our guy is descended from the lead of the head character, the boss of the Dead Rabbits.
Right.
So intrinsically, he's fucking great in a fight. He's just got this natural ability to kick the shit out of people, which he uses to his advantage.
That's DiCaprio's gang in the Scorsese film.
Sure. I haven't watched Gangs of New York,
I haven't.
Oh. No.
I love Scorsese.
There's a lot of stuff I haven't watched. Yeah. So I apologize.
No.
You haven't read Hitman.
I
haven't watched Gangs of New York.
But I'm going to read Hitman.
And I'll have to watch Gangs of New York.
Just Scorsese's great, period.
He is, yes. There's no doubt about it. Yeah. So yeah, that's our kind of meta sort of little bit.
Got it.
But it's not even really discussed. The first 2 issues are done, but there's been no mention of that so far. It may or may not be played upon.
Sure.
I don't know. But it's more about just him struggling desperately to try re-establish himself as the gangster and help his wife and get him out of this shitty situation. But of course, everything goes terribly wrong. Of course, it wouldn't be a nice easy transit with it. So that's the thing.
Do you feel like you're being kind of slotted into this category where you do these gritty kind of Hitman, Punisher kind of?
Honestly, when I was a kid, all I wanted to do was draw Spider-Man and the Hulk
I know.
and Batman
I
and
keep
Superman.
on thinking about that.
Oh yeah, that's all I wanted to do. But the way my career is sort of twisted and turned, I've not really had the opportunity to do those sort of things.
Do you still have the charm and the feel for that?
You know, I'm not 100% sure. I think I've got to the point now where I still like to read superhero comics, but I quite enjoy drawing what I'm drawing now. And I see the future of comics as being creator-owned sort of stuff. So I'm only too happy to just sit and do my books with Jerry and whomever, and do my creator-owned thing.
Right.
I mean, admittedly, if DC came calling and said, "John, we want to give you a 5-part Batman series, and Jeff Lemire's going to write it," I might down tools and sort of consider moving over to DC for a short while.
Sure.
But that's never going to fucking happen.
Sure.
So I'm going to sit and do my stuff. Yeah, I really enjoy drawing noir stuff. There's nothing I do better than dirty alleyways and people beating the shit out of people in dirty alleyways. That is almost my thing.
Wheelhouse?
Yeah, my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
So I there's no point in being bitter about it. Screw that. I'm still drawing comics. I'm still having a good time. I'm doing a job that most people would give their eye teeth to do. So, fuck it. I'm happy enough.
Anything interesting that's happened while you've been here in Toronto? Anything that speaks to Toronto?
Well, I've just been stuck in the show all weekend, and I love Toronto. It's a great town. Really, really lovely place. I've been here a whole bunch of times. So, I'm not... But it was St. Paddy's Days yesterday, and I was out till 12, God, I'm getting old.
Gotta be at the hotel for the convention.
Well, this is the thing.
Yeah.
That's why most of the stories I tell sort of hark back to the golden days of comics, when you didn't have to be back at the convention center and earning money.
Well, I think it's changed. I mean,
totally.
Just look at this.
Yeah.
We're not seeing any comics. We're just seeing a lot of, forgive me for saying this, but crap that's designed to be moved at this time in quantity as much as possible, because it's all disposable.
Sure.
And it's not about the comics. It's about the ephemera and the memorabilia, and it's just become this kind of Disneyland of garage sale, flea market crap,
Well put.
And
well put. You've said it very well.
Yeah.
It's true. I mean, I do go to shows,
and I miss the old shows too.
Sure.
Which I just saw a little bit of when I was a kid.
Sure. Yeah. Oh no. I mean, those times were great. I remember sitting I remember my first cosplay experience in the UK back in it must have been mid-80s or something like that.
Did you projectile vomit?
Oh, sure, every day. But, but that's not the story.
No, I mean because of the cosplay.
Oh, God, no. Though Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons were both at the show. Watchmen was in ascendance.
Okay, what year was this, 1986?
86 it must have been.
And you were at the show as an attendee or as a
I was
practitioner?
there. I was actually that was my first show that I had got in. No, I tell a lie. I was there as with my portfolio, shilling my stuff
and
about.
This is in London?
Yeah. But I walked into the bar in the student union, and there was a guy standing in the corner. He was a big fat guy, and he was completely naked except for a tiny thong. And he had painted himself blue, shaved his head, unless he didn't need to, shaved his head, painted himself blue, and drawn a little white circle with a dot on it, on his forehead, and it was in a sort of matte paint that was flaking off, and he was sitting there with a pint, drinking, in the corner, and I just looked at it and went, what the fuck? Why do you think that doing that is a good idea for anyone? For yourself?
This goes back to 1986.
I know, it was, but to tell the truth, I have forgotten most everything about that convention except him.
Right.
So fair play to him. Fair play to him. You got to admire his gumption, his balls, his whatever. But I mean, that's cosplay at its finest.
And the phenomenon of it that really sticks with me is, no matter how many of these things I go to, it's the first day. So my first day here was on the Friday. I had to pop in to do something, and I come down the escalator. Sure. There are all these people in costumes, and like you say, it's power to them because they don't care about their body image. Now, I'm not lean and mean and, toned. But at the same time, I wouldn't wear like leggings and like a skin hugging thing. Like, I see like a tubby Dr. Fate walk by, and it still like blows my mind that
he's going to do that.
Yeah, that he's going to do that.
Yeah, I know. I think it's a great sort of thing because they put on a costume and they become somebody else.
They become somebody.
And they can live something else.
And they get rewarded now for it because people take selfies with them.
Sure.
And you don't even have to buy a ticket to the con. You can just stand out there in the lobby, and that's what they do. They just walk around and
and get photographed and chat with other cosplayers.
And that's it.
Yeah. I know.
So
I know. Fair play to them. It's that's their bag.
Yeah.
And I wish them all the best with it. But nobody will ever be as good as Dr. Manhattan.
I know.
In the UCAC,
in the Student Union pub.
Right in the Student Union bar, UCAC in 1986. He was my finest cosplay.
I just love to have seen Alan Moore and him come face to face at that moment.
Yeah. I think Alan would probably have hugged him.
Or Alan would have exploded into a million tiny particles that
possibly
just fell to the floor.
Fluttered gently to the floor. Through the moat, like dancing like moats through the shafts of sunlight coming through the window.
Yeah.
Something along those lines.
John, it's been a pleasure.
It's been good talking to you too.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Tell us what you think. Write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or contact us through social media. Find all the links on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. We're also on the Comics Podcast Network at comicspodcasts.com and on comicon.com, where our new episodes appear a few days before they show up anywhere else. Also, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, iHeartRadio, or wherever you find podcasts. We really need more listeners to give us reviews and help us stand out from the many comics podcasts that are out there. Our theme is from bensound.com. Once again, don't forget to help support the show with a pledge at patreon.com/deconcomics. Next Monday on Critiquing Comics, Mulele and I discuss Vengeance Nevada, Issue 1, by B.J. Mendelsohn and Piotr Seplarski, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Pizza by Daniel Arudamasa and Nick Marino. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.